Close your eyes for a moment and step back. It's 1965. The air smells of fresh-cut Kentucky bluegrass and charcoal smoke from a neighbor's grill. You're standing on a sidewalk in a brand-new American suburb. The street is lined with young maples, and in every driveway sits a car with chrome bumpers that catch the afternoon sun. Back then, the American dream wasn't a metaphor or a marketing slogan. It was a physical reality made of wood, brick, and mortar. It was the 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom ranch-style house. And the price tag hanging on that dream? Roughly $15,000. To a young family today, that number sounds like a typographical error. It sounds like a fantasy from a different planet. But for the generation that built modern America, $15,000 was the standard. It represented roughly twice the average annual salary. It meant that a single income, one person working at the local plant, the hardware store, or the post office, could provide a safe, permanent sanctuary for a spouse and 3 children. The mortgage payment was perhaps $60 or $70 a month. It was a fixed, predictable anchor in an uncertain world. It allowed for a life where the biggest financial stress was the cost of a new television or a family road trip to the coast. There was a sense of permanence. You didn't just buy a house, you bought a stake in your community. You knew your neighbors because they weren't planning on moving every 3 years to chase a lower rent or a slightly better interest rate. But as we look at the quiet, tree-lined streets of our memories, we have to ask the difficult question, what happened? How did that $15,000 sanctuary transform into a $600,000 debt trap? How did a basic human necessity become a high-stakes speculative asset for global corporations? To find the answer, we have to perform a bit of economic archaeology. We have to dig beneath the surface of inflation and look at the structural shifts that fundamentally changed the rules of the American game.
If you ask a mainstream economist why housing is so expensive today, they will give you a simple answer: inflation. They will tell you that $1 in 1965 is simply worth less than $1 today. And while that's true, it's a convenient half-truth that hides the real theft of the middle class. If housing had followed the general rate of inflation, that $15,000 house from 1965 should cost roughly $140,000 today. In many parts of America, you can't even buy a vacant lot for that price. The cost of shelter has detached itself from the reality of the American paycheck. The first layer of our archaeology takes us to the year 1971. For those of us who lived through it, it felt like just another year of headlines and cultural shifts. But in the world of finance, it was the year the floor fell out. When the United States officially ended the gold standard, the dollar became a fiat currency, backed by nothing but a promise. Before 1971, the dollar was a store of value. After 1971, it became a melting ice cube. As the currency began to lose its purchasing power, those with deep pockets realized that holding cash was a losing game. They needed to put their wealth into hard assets. And what is the hardest, most essential asset in the world? The land beneath our feet and the roofs over our heads. This was the moment housing shifted from being a shelter to being a hedge against inflation. Suddenly, the house wasn't just where you raised your kids, it was a vehicle to protect wealth from a depreciating dollar. This created a new kind of demand, not from families looking for a home, but from investors looking for a shield. At the same time, a second detachment was occurring. For decades, productivity and wages grew in lockstep. As the American worker became more efficient, their paycheck grew accordingly. But in the mid-1970s, those lines diverged. Productivity kept climbing, but real wages, adjusted for the cost of living, stagnated. We were working harder and producing more, but the dream was getting more expensive. The $15,000 house was gone, replaced by the $30,000, then the $60,000 house. To keep the dream alive, the system introduced a new tool: debt. If we couldn't afford the house with our wages, the banks would bridge the gap with credit. We traded the safe anchor of a low-cost home for the chain of a massive mortgage. We were told this was progress. We were told that rising home prices were a good thing because it meant our net worth was going up. But for the average family, that net worth was trapped in the walls of their own home, while the cost of every other necessity continued to climb. As we move our archaeological dig into the 1980s and 90s, we see the arrival of the financialization era. This is where the story takes a darker turn. In the Golden Age, your mortgage was a local affair. You went to the local savings and loan, you shook hands with a man who lived in your town, and that bank held your mortgage in their vault until it was paid off. They had a vested interest in your success because your house was part of their community's stability. But the rules changed. Wall Street discovered a way to bundle thousands of mortgages together and sell them as mortgage-backed securities. Suddenly, your home wasn't a contract between you and your neighborly banker. It was a tiny piece of a global gambling game. This led directly to the 2008 financial crisis, a trauma many of us remember all too vividly. We saw neighbors lose homes they had lived in for 20 years. We saw the housing bubble burst. But while the average American family was reeling from the crash, global investment firms saw an opportunity. Before 2008, the idea of a massive corporation owning thousands of single-family homes was almost unheard of. Houses were for families, apartments were for investors. But in the wake of the crash, firms like BlackRock and Vanguard realized they could buy up distressed American neighborhoods for pennies on the dollar. They weren't looking to flip these houses. They were looking to build a rentership society. Think about the psychological shift. In 1965, the goal was to own your home outright by the time you retired. Ownership meant freedom. It meant no one could knock on your door and tell you to leave. It meant your cost of living dropped significantly in your golden years. But in a rentership society, the goal is reversed. The corporate landlord wants you to pay rent forever. They want to turn the American dream into a monthly subscription service. When a corporation buys a house in a suburban cul-de-sac, they aren't just outbidding a young couple. They are removing that house from the ownership pool forever. They have access to billions of dollars in near-zero interest loans, loans that you and I can never get. They can afford to pay 20% over the asking price because they're not looking at the monthly mortgage payment. They're looking at the 30-year cash flow. This is why the $15,000 house is dead. It has been replaced by an institutional asset class. Your neighborhood is no longer a community of stakeholders. It is a portfolio being managed by an algorithm in a skyscraper 500 miles away. But the corporate takeover isn't the only ghost haunting the American home. Even for those of us who managed to buy our homes decades ago, the golden age is being squeezed from another direction: the tax trap. In the 1960s, property taxes were a modest contribution to local schools and roads. Today, for many retirees, property taxes have become a second mortgage that never ends. We see this specifically in states that brag about having no income tax. They often make up the difference by aggressively reassessing home values. As the market value of your home is driven up by corporate buyers and outside investors, your tax bill follows. You may have paid off your mortgage in 1995, but you are now paying more in taxes and insurance than your parents paid for their entire house in 1965. This creates a hidden eviction. We see seniors who have lived in their homes for 40 years being forced to sell because they can no longer afford the carrying costs of the wealth trapped in their homes. The system is designed to keep wealth in motion, preventing the average family from ever truly finding the fixed anchor of the golden age. Furthermore, we must look at the regulation gap. In the 1950s, we built houses at a feverish pace. The GI Bill and a sense of national purpose meant that we prioritized supply. Today, a maze of zoning laws, environmental impact fees, and not-in-my-backyard politics has made it nearly impossible to build the starter home. Developers don't want to build 1,500-square-foot ranches anymore. The margins aren't high enough. They want to build McMansions or luxury condos. The starter home, the very foundation of the middle class, has been regulated out of existence. This leaves the younger generation, our children and grandchildren, in a precarious position. They are forced to rent from the very corporations that outbid them, or they are forced to take on life-sentence debt to buy a home that is often smaller and more poorly built than the homes of 1965. As we dig through these layers of archaeology, from the end of the gold standard to the rise of Wall Street landlords, we begin to see the truth. The housing crisis isn't an accident. It isn't just the way things are. It is the result of 50 years of policy choices that favored capital over people.
So, where does this leave us? For those of us in the golden age of our lives, what is the insight we must take from this archaeological dig? First, we must reject the narrative that your home is your best investment. For our generation, that may have been true, but looking forward, a home should be viewed for what it was always meant to be: shelter and stability. If you have a paid-off home or a low-interest mortgage, guard it. It is the last remaining piece of the old rules that still works in your favor. Second, we must understand the importance of equity over debt. The modern financial system wants you to treat your home like an ATM. They want you to take out home equity lines of credit to fund your lifestyle or buy depreciating assets. Don't fall for it. In the 2026 economy, the most valuable thing you can own is an unencumbered roof over your head. Third, for those looking to help the next generation, we must rethink the inheritance. Simply leaving a sum of money may not be enough in an era of high inflation and corporate housing. If you have the means, consider the family compound or multi-generational mindset. Protecting the land and the home within the family is the only way to shield your descendants from the Rentership Society. The $15,000 house is a ghost. It belongs to a world of black and white television, rotary phones, and a dollar that was as good as gold. We cannot go back to 1965, but we can learn from it. We can remember that a healthy society is built on homeowners, not renters. We can remember that a home is a place for a family to grow, not a line item for a hedge fund. And most importantly, we can use this insight to make better choices for our own families, ensuring that the golden age doesn't just remain a memory, but becomes a legacy we protect. Before we go, I want to ask you, what was the price of your first home? And do you think your children or grandchildren will ever experience the same sense of security that home gave you? Share your story in the comments below. Let's keep the memory and the insight alive. Thank you for watching the Golden Age Insight.